Okay, we're going to continue reading Power in Place, Indian Education in America. We're on page 92. Bad state is made accordingly to the ability of the state and its leaders to allow all human beings therein to realize their share or part of virtue to the fullest. The distinction between a good state structure and its leaders and a corrupt state structure and its political leaders arise and falls with the ability of both leader and structure to allow all humans in society to develop their virtue to the fullest. Ethics and politics are inextricably linked in Aristotle's thought. Inextricably. The key elements to Aristotle's political and ethical theory are human beings. The state and the summa bonum, one can and ought to read Aristotle's reference to the state as government. Aristotle's experience in 4th century Greece explains why he understood the state as the highest good of all. The city-state was the largest and most extensive social institution in Greece. Its formal creation of law and respect for customs and habit created the natural social environment for human development. Consequently, Aristotle sees the state as the institution which embraces all the rest, aims at good in a greater degree than any other, and at the highest good. Aristotle recognizes that people require a social existence to be most fully human. He recognizes that social experience, primarily through custom and habit, plays a substantial role in shaping one's values and beliefs. Although born political, that is, social animals, our ethics or lack thereof will necessarily be products of the society and political institutions that shape us. Therefore, the study of ethics, morality, entails the examination of the social arrangements and relations in which we find human beings. Although Aristotle's basic logic is similar to that underpinning indigenous North American politics and ethics, the terms of his theory are significantly different from indigenous theory. This paragraph is called A Comparison of Aristotle's Ideas to Indigenous Thought. Traditional native thought agrees with Aristotle's linkage between an individual's ethical development and one's community. However, unlike Aristotle's treatment of the state or community, which consists exclusively of human beings, traditional native thinkers include as a part of their political communities many more other than human persons, including persons that swim, winged persons, four-legged persons, and so on. In short, while Western thought, following Aristotle's lead, defines politics and ethics as exclusively human issues and endeavors, native thought and, more importantly, practices have defined politics and ethics as involving a much broader conception of persons. This point is obvious in the stories, oral traditions, and ceremonies and social life of native peoples. Many of our languages even offer evidence in support of this claim. In their earliest interactions with the Iroquois, French Jesuits recorded that the Iroquois seemed confused with respect to who or what constituted a person. The confusion was the Jesuits, not the Iroquois. The Iroquois understood the concept of a person or personhood to include plants, animals, and other natural features of their environment. Their language expressed this understanding. As a result, when they considered their moral and political community, it was perfectly reasonable to include the non or other than human persons, plants, animals, and some other natural phenomena as community members. This very ancient idea is the basis of an implicit environmental ethos, or ethos, that leads one to fundamentally different notions about how we ought to relate to the environment. apply technology, and generally live with the earth. The worldview attendant to this ethos requires one to speak of a moral sphere that goes beyond merely thinking that morality is about the relationships you and I have as human beings. Morality and politics have to do with morality and politics have to do with a reality that involves relationships we have with other than human persons of the biosphere and the ecology we human beings are a part of. Morality and politics require that we acquaint ourselves with the many personalities we interact with daily. Natural resource managers, public policy makers, scientists, and the general public can gain much by developing policies and practices formed by this key feature of indigenous North American worldviews. The best illustration of how Native peoples include many other natural objects and living beings as members of their community is found in Native clan systems and totems. It is frustrating to constantly hear non-Native peoples speaking romantically of the Indians' closeness to nature or love of nature. The relationship is more profound than most people can imagine, and the implications of this relationship will imply uncomfortable consequences for many. To be wolf, bear, or deer clan means that you are kin to these other persons. These are known and understood as your relatives. As Onondaga elder Oren Lyons remarked during the 25th anniversary Earth Day celebration in Washington, D.C., we don't call a tree a resource. We don't call a fish a resource. We don't call the bison a resource. We call them our relatives. But the general population uses the term resources, so you want to be careful of that term. Resources for just you? A radical shift in awareness and behavior occurs when one no longer considers nature as full of resources, but of relatives. Like all kinship relations, certain obligations and rights are assumed with membership in a clan. The customs, habits, obligations, and rights that correspond with clan and special societies in our tribes served to constantly remind us of the complex community that shapes our identity and ensues our continued existence. As Native peoples, all clan identified and numerous ceremonies exist to, among other things, reinforce this awareness of our relatedness and connection to these other beings. We persons, inclusive of plant and animal persons and human beings, are all related and connected. These are the so-called new insights of evolution, ecology, and environmental science, and they are very ancient wisdom of our traditional elders or true indigenous scholars. Because in nearly all of our native creation stories, animal and plant persons exist before human persons. These kin exist as our elders. These animal and plant elders, as much of our human elders, are our guides. They are members of our community. Aristotle proposed that our values, guiding how we ought to live, are learned from our fellow community members. From an indigenous perspective, Aristotle's basic reasoning was right, but his notion of community and its members was wrong. Native people would argue that it makes no sense to limit the notion of politics and ethics to only human beings. How we human beings live will indeed reflect the communities we belong to, however, by limiting the definition of persons to human beings. Aristotle created a false and far too narrow sense of community and corresponding spheres of political and moral life. This inclusion of other living beings and natural objects into a category of persons, which includes human beings, requires a notion of politics and ethics inclusive of these other community members. The comparison to Aristotle can be further extended. Aristotle recognized that it took human beings with many different parts of virtue to make a community. Artists, builders, farmers, designers, and so on are all required to make a strong community. Each person has what I have what I have chosen to call a different share of virtue. Today, we often speak of personal/professional strengths and weaknesses. Aristotle's point is obvious. We are not all good at the same thing. All of us are much better at doing some things than others. In Aristotle's mind, this is natural and to be expected. The manner in which Aristotle develops this idea is to create a hierarchical, divided sense of virtue is necessarily limited given the incompleteness and partiality of his observations. As a rule of Aristotle's limited experience, he inevitably speaks of different virtues as more virtuous than others. However, if Aristotle's notion of virtue is treated as a complex totality, a concept with manifold parts, it seems to me that what is right about Aristotle's reasoning can be kept and what is wrong can be discarded. Aristotle's argument seems reasonable, but he stopped short of seeing the big picture, as Figure 1 illustrates, and I'm going to describe the picture here pretty soon. Replace the key elements of Aristotle's theory, human beings, society, and sunum bonum, with American Indian concepts of persons, ecosystems, and ecosystem sustainability of health. And you have a complex living system of politics and ethics. According to Aristotle, it is the political and moral sphere of human existence that distinguishes human life from the rest of the natural life on Earth. Aristotle was right to see the good state and the good leaders as those that allowed members to develop their particular or shared virtues to the fullest. And in figure 1 here is a comparison, Aristotelian Western and Indigenous politics and ethics. It is a picture with on the left side has the word Western, on the other side has American Indian, and Western has human beings, state, individual liberty, and human scale, utilitarianism. And then on the American Indian side has human beings, plants, animals, physical features of nature, ecosystem, respect, and ecosystem sustainability. And in the middle, persons describe the persons. So the Western is just human beings, and American Indian involves human beings, plants, animals, and physical features of nature. Then society, community is the state, and then American Indian side is ecosystem. And sunum bonum, which is the greatest good for Western, is the individual liberty and human scale utilitarianism. And on the American Indian side is respect and ecosystem sustainability. So that is figure 1 on page 96. Then I'll continue. However, from a native standpoint, Aristotle stops short of grasping the big picture in the more accurate and immediate way. He too narrowly defines persons and community, or more properly, the state. In so doing, he poses a view of the greatest good that fairly ensues the environmental mess human beings have created. By excluding the many other than human persons of the natural world from active full participation and determination of the greatest good, ecological catastrophe seems guaranteed. Whether intentional or not, the result of this single idea has been to create a worldview where humans are thought to be above the rest of nature, superior by virtue of the fact that human evolution has resulted in our species possessing an intraspecies adaptive ability to reason, an idea that has brought us to the brink of global ecological crisis by reducing the question, the very idea, of the summa bonum to be about relationships among human beings. As Indigenous conception of the summum bonum is rich and complex when compared to Aristotle's fairly simple conception of it, by analogy, the Iroquoian concept of personhood and community, as concisely summarized by John Mohawk in Animal Native Rights to Survive, entails a concept of the greatest good that includes the four-legged persons, the winged persons, the persons that swim, and the plant persons. It is, in fact, more complex. The Iroquoian concept of the greatest good requires that human beings have more relationships, interdependencies, and persons to be attentive to when considering how to act. From a moral and political viewpoint to realize the sunum bonum. I propose it is precisely this experiential insight that allows comparison to indigenous notions of relatedness and connectedness. Although a virtual cottage industry has developed among some scholars seeking to debunk any claim that native peoples were alike, their recently arrived European neighbors, in their interaction with their natural environment, it seems to me many have missed the crucial point. Our ancestors possessed technology, and they certainly used it to affect their environment. However, their use of technology was guided by an underlying premise that Bacon, Locke, Newton, and most modern engineers would have found incredible. Our natural environments contain many more persons than our human selves, and these other than human persons are members of our political and ethical community and require respect. Experience shaped Aristotle's and native peoples' conception of politics and ethics. Aristotle's careful observation of human society led him to abandon a single ideal form of the state for a general theory that allowed for the particularity and diversity of various human situations and conditions. He concluded that the state was the highest expression of virtue because it constituted the site where the fullest expression of virtue could occur. The ethical dimension of the state was found in its character as the active and healthy combination of all virtues, or what I have called the manifold shares of parts of virtue as a complex totality. Indigenous thought suggests power does reside in the places and personalities that surround us. Consequently, possessing the power to do the right thing depends on understanding the entire ecosystem as the community in which virtue can be fully recognized in its complex totality. Modern ecology and indigenous models of politics and ethics have much in common. They are both about the complex relationships between living organisms and their environment. Indigenous thought has, in my mind, one key advantage. It sees the ecosystem as the appropriate site for the study of politics and ethics. The era of Aristotle's thinking and the great era of subsequent Western thinking about politics and ethics is that it mistakenly and artificially takes human beings out of the community that, in the most direct physical and spiritual sense, our existence and identity depend on. Not surprisingly, many non-native environmentalists and ecologists have made the connection between biology, environment, and the very important questions about how we ought to live. What passes today as the science of ecology is nothing more than a restatement of very old native North American concepts. Unfortunately, once again, this has been treated as a great discovery, a little like the discovery of America some 500 years ago. To native peoples, this knowledge is not new, it is very ancient. Although the scientific treatment of reality and the concepts that describe it are to some extent different, the knowledge of the physical attributes and relationships held by many traditional natives is equivalent, if not superior, to the knowledge held by modern ecologists. It is superior primarily in the sense that traditional indigenous scholars operate minus the ideology that humans are somehow in their unique nature destined to live above the rest of the natural world. The ideas offered here should not be misconstrued as suggesting 1. A carte blanche return to previous non-modern ways of living, or 2. A condemnation of all things modern, for it is neither. The suggestion is to evaluate the ideas independent of a simplistic, abstract, in fact idealist, linear view of history that sees Western civilization, including some of its scientific practices, at the front of leading edge of history, with all other cultures behind and retarded, or behind and hoping to catch up. A traditional American Indian view of politics and ethics facilitates understanding of a view of history that accords space or place at least as much importance in a conception of history as that given to time and chronology, and chronology in Western civilization. What is thereby gained is an entire body of collective tribal experience, a foundation, really, that can serve to literally ground an education for life or living, a foundation shaping practices and thought that are more applicable to the issues we face on the planet today than the dominant Western model of politics and ethics, because it contains an inherent and implicit environmental ethos. Chapter 11, it's called Property and Self-Government as Educational Initiatives. Indian students tend to look at education as a formal institutional experience. Core courses, graduation requirements, and electives were taken in sufficient quantities, produce degrees and certificates. We are then authorized to perform certain functions in the adult world or become qualified to move on to the next level of educational complexity and attainment. In recent decades, practical experience, the summer and semester internship, and on-the-job training have begun to supplement formal academic studies, and the development of the paraprofessional in a number of areas offers a temporary resting place for those who are still uncertain of the attractiveness of the profession. Substantial education begins when the student, well trained in a profession, actually begins to perform professional tasks. At that point, the accumulated experience of applying abstract knowledge and principles to real-life problems and duties provide the final educational opportunity. We learn as we live and bring ideas and actions together. In America, the practical side of learning is taken for granted, and in most instances is regarded as a higher activity than a mere book learning. That is why we say that things are academic when we mean that they are necessarily That is why we say that things are academic when we mean that they are essentially useless and have a certain degree of novelty. But the glorification of the self-made person, the worship of the school of hard knocks, and the demand that leadership have practical experience in identifiable fields means that we cherish what we have been able to accumulate in the way of practical wisdom much more than we admire abstract thinking and precise intellectual analysis. Students in higher education should become aware of the high premium that American society places on practical knowledge, because it constitutes the hidden side of federal policy, and it is seen by most policymakers as a realistic alternative to formal academic training and services. Tracing federal efforts to provide academic training for American Indian children is not difficult. Educational experiments leap out of the pages of books, reports, and are always described in highly emotional language. From the initial overture of English colonists in Virginia through the Merriam Report to the modern Kennedy Report, formal academic training is touted as the salvation of Indians and as the primary vehicle for assimilating Indians into the American mass society. But we have to dig carefully to see the other side of the coin, to see the multitude of times when Congress, frustrated at dealing with the Indian problems, simply washed its hands of the whole thing and declared the Indians could learn by doing things for themselves. James Watt was not radically different from the impatient bureaucrats of 2 centuries ago, when it came to understanding the benefits of a practical education. Looking at the history of federal policy, we can identify 2 areas in which Congress frequently refused to deal with complexities and instead advocated policies that would force Indians, whether they were prepared or not, to learn to live in American society using only their experiences as a guide. The 2 areas are the use and ownership of property and the efforts to establish a modicum of self-government. The guiding principles behind federal policy in these 2 areas is that Indians must place in a situation in which they have to confront and solve certain kinds of abstract and practical problems. 2 entirely Two entirely predictable results are produced by these policy changes. Indians sometimes succeeded far beyond the expectation of Congress. If they are very successful, it produces intense jealousy among neighboring whites and fear among federal bureaucrats, and then steps are taken to limit the potential of the program, or it is terminated altogether. If the Indian adjustment does not make sense in the white person's terms, even if the Indians are pleased with the results, then the program is declared a failure. But the responsibility for the failure is placed on the Indian response, not on the rationality of the policy proposal in the first place. We can easily illustrate the operation of these principles in the history of federal policy. First, however, we should examine the nature of practical education, as it is the practical aspect of things that non-Indian policymakers take for granted and upon which they rely even when all indications are that of the direction policy takes will be a disaster. Practical education is the application of the abstract principle to conditions of real life. It is also the means of discovering principles for predicting future events based upon a vast reservoir of experiences of the same or similar events. While wholly academic knowledge is predictable because we arrange it in a manner so that it will be predictable, knowledge gained through experience cannot be controlled. We learn both good and bad things from life, and consequently, policy that naively believes that by creating conditions under which people learn through experience can have but one result, and that one a beneficial product is not a good policy. The flaw in the policy is that we cannot control the end product, and therefore we should not rely upon an abstract knowledge unless it has become part of a community life that it is also practical knowledge. Let us now take a few examples from Indian history and see how practical knowledge or education has been a part of policy and what has happened to it. This paragraph is called Examples from Indian History. In the early colonial days in Massachusetts, missionaries spent considerable time seeking converts among the tribes. People accepting Christianity were encouraged to adopt colonist dress and habits, leave their families and communities, and take up residence in what came to be known as praying towns. Give me a second. Sorry, I'm just marking this page real quick. As praying towns, sometimes, of course, whole families would convert, and occasionally bands and villages would make the transition to Christian life. It wasn't long before Massachusetts had a number of praying towns that were organized as regular townships with the same social and political institutions as other subdivisions of the Commonwealth. In making the transition, that is to say, in creating a town government, church, market, and all the other institutions that New England life required, Indians learned both good and bad things from the whites around them. The result was that while some Indian towns functioned as well as their white neighbors, others did not. Shortcomings were blamed on the Indian character, and consequently, Massachusetts introduced a trustee over the Indian towns. By the 1870s, they had virtually eliminated self-government for the Indians of the state. Political status and property rights were essentially eliminated, and the justification for divesting the Indians of these things was basically that they had learned the wrong lessons in the classroom of life. The removal policy demonstrates even more clearly the relationship between practical education and political status and property rights. It was exceedingly difficult for federal representatives to deal with the tribes west of the Appalachians in the post-Revolutionary War period. So the tribes were told that if they adopted forms of government comparable to those used by the states and the federal government, it would facilitate the process of diplomacy and enable the federal government to provide services and protection for the tribes on a much more efficient basis. We can trace modifications of forms of government in almost every tribe who had dealings with the United States in the early decades of the 19th century. No changes are as clear as those adopted by the Cherokees, who sought to create a modern government and largely succeeded. Presumably, the success of the Cherokees in transforming their traditional ways into modern political institutions should have been sufficient to ensure them protection of their political status and property rights. However, the Cherokees were too successful. The local whites coveted the Cherokee lands, and eventually the state of Georgia simply moved its people in on those lands. When the problem reached the Supreme Court, it chose to define the Cherokee as a people in tutelage, a people still on the verge of national existence, but lacking the practical education and experience to make a successful transition. The Cherokees and subsequently all Indian tribes thereafter were described as wards of the government, as people who lacked sufficient education and maturity to make their own decisions. As a result of the removal policy, a large number of tribes were moved to Kansas and Oklahoma. The hope being that once beyond the reach of bad whites, the tribes could make a successful transition to civilized life. The Kansas Indians, learning through the school of hard knocks, became moderately successful in farming and adopted so many of the characteristics of their white neighbors that the state of Kansas believed they were no longer Indians and sought to tax them. The Supreme Court said no. The beginning of the Civil War and continuing a decade after, the Kansas tribes were pressured to sell their Kansas lands, most of which had been allotted and moved to Oklahoma, where they would be given lands in communal status once again. The practical knowledge that they had acquired in Kansas was discounted by Congress because it had produced unexpected results. 30 years later, the tribes were again forced to take their lands in severalty so that they could once more learn from practical experience how to manage farming-sized tracts of land. The pattern only becomes stronger as we approach contemporary times. The General Allotment Act was justified on the basis that the Indians needed to learn how to manage their property. In 1891, only 4 years after the passage of the act, it was amended to allow the Secretary of the Interior to manage allotments on behalf of the individuals. Presumably, he was a more apt pupil, or perhaps needed the experience more. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 was touted as a great experiment in self-government. This in spite of the fact that the tribes had governed themselves adequately for thousands of years, and had at least managed to preserve something of a homeland using the makeshift governments organized by the federal government in the 1870s and 1880s. Coincident with the allotment of lands and the support of self-government came changes in the federal government's educational programs. Off-reservation boarding schools were established in precisely the years that reservations were being allotted. During the Indian Reorganization Act, a loan fund was established to encourage Indians to attend college and advanced vocational and trade schools. By the time of the New Deal, educational programs both supported the existing trends in policy and forecast the future of policy direction. In the 1950s, termination became the dominant federal policy, and it was supposed to free Indians from unnecessary federal restrictions and allow them to use their property in the same manner as other American citizens. No sane capitalist, however, would have sold a large virgin standing forest as the Klamaths were forced to do, and no white business person would have agreed to use his or her sawmill as the sole tax base for a county as the Menominees were required to do. Additionally, and here is where the theory of termination was revealed as totally bankrupt, both the Klamaths and Menominees were placed under private trustee so that the practical experience they were supposed to receive from the termination became, once again, an education that their trustees enjoyed the detriment of the tribes. Termination of the various tribes coincided with the push to relocate individual Indians and their families to western and midwestern urban centers. Relocation and vocational training were the major emphases of the federal government until the mid-1960s, when, because the program was such an embarrassment to the federal government, it was retitled Employment Assistance. The relegated to a minor item of the Bureau of Indian Affairs budget in terms of both formal academic and more practical vocational education. The 1950s demonstrated that an intimate link existed between what was offered to Indians in the way of educational programs and desperate attempts by Congress to make the natural resources of the reservation lands available to white Americans and to reduce tribal government to nearly an advisory capacity. This paragraph is called Recent Events and Programs. The last 4 decades are very interesting when examined in this larger historical pattern. Events and programs have moved so fast that there is no time to lag between manipulation of property and tribal status and the promulgation of additional educational programs. Indian tribes were supposed to absorb simultaneously the policy of self-determination, rapid development of reservation lands, and rapid changes in educational programs. The result was a rare intersection in which educational programs were narrowed to produce administrators and managers, with the smattering of science and professional fields factored in. Among the problems created in this massive change were the shifting reservoir of resources available to the tribes to develop programs, the educational requirements necessary to operate programs, and the absence of a time lag between the conception and operation of programs. Many economic development programs were funded under the guise of vocational training. Other economic programs had to be recast as vocational training because of a lack of Indian experience in certain fields. Eligibility for employment in some programs depended wholly on academic achievements, and the Indians with degrees in forestry and other hard sciences often found themselves operating educational programs or trying to administer complicated umbrella development programs. Evaluations of programs funded with federal dollars often began at about the same time that the program themselves started, making it impossible to judge what effects the program actually would have on the reservations. Not only were conditions extremely confusing, but under Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and Bill Clinton, federal funding was reduced drastically, making it imperative that Indian tribes find alternative sources of funding for economic development, tribal government, and education. As we begin the new century, many tribes can be described as existing at ground zero, reduced to provide the very minimal programs their communities needed to exist. Although many tribal leaders take a pessimistic view of the present situation, when we see modern conditions in a historical perspective, we can see that there is reason for considerable optimism. It is no longer possible for Congress to announce a new program of changing the status of tribal governments or tribal property with the naive hope that their practical education Indians will be able to accomplish some nebulous goal of assimilating into American society. Indeed, the new federalism, even if it is to remain but an unfounded slogan, clearly shows that the tendency of Congress is to devise new methods whereby Indians can define their paths for the future. Blythe reviews of the efficacy of private property no longer prevail. Efficacy of private property no longer prevail. And even though recent Supreme Court decisions have tended to limit the scope of tribal powers, the legislative trend is clearly to vest more programs, powers, and responsibilities in tribal governments. This paragraph is called the Modern Educational Experience. What is the relevance of connecting practical education, as seen in the policy changes of the past, with modern educational problems? And what future insights can be gained by today's college-age Indian students in viewing in this much larger historical perspective the educational programs in which they are engaged? What does the relationship of practical, ill-conceived education and formal academic training have to tell us about the immediate prospects of jobs for graduating Indian students? These questions and many other now surround the modern educational experience. Taken together, they suggest that we look at professional education in an entirely different manner. The professional education, particularly the education in the hard sciences and computers, has basically replaced practical education because the lack of lag time between when a policy is initiated and when it is supposed to be operating has been reduced to practically zero. We need expertise in order to consider programs. For the first time in Indian history, we can place practical, on-the-job training after the authorization of policy changes. Indians with professional expertise must now be prepared to offer their tribes predictive scenarios based upon their professional training. The degree to which an Indian professional can succeed with any tribal program will be assured by the number of possible scenarios with which he or she presents the tribe. It will then be the task of the tribe to choose among possible competing scenarios. Tribes will have to choose the alternatives based upon their analysis of existing resources and level of education. Even more important, however, is that much of modern scientific thought, particularly that dealing with the environment, closely parallels traditional perspectives on how lands, peoples, and resources should be used. The absence of time lag between articulation of policy and the mustering of resources to carry it out suggests that, for the first time in history, there can be and must be Indian input into program planning. Some planners may argue that there has always been Indian input in reservation development programs or plans, but this argument is difficult to sustain. While the Bureau of Indian Affairs was busy expanding the number of Indian college students during the early 1960s, Congress was significantly expanding the potential for tribes to lease their lands in 99 years. And the Bureau was pressuring tribes to develop massive programs to exploit natural resources of the reservations. Although the gap between professionally trained Indians and tribal activities was lessening during this period, it was certainly not in any sense being coordinated in order to produce maximum or even any sensible results. The uranium mining and strip mining programs of the 1960s and 1970s probably could not occur today on many Indian reservations because professional expertise has caught up to or is only slightly behind proposed projects. Indian students working with tribal development programs will notice a slight important shift in emphasis in tribal perspectives. They will no longer be expected to provide direction for tribal programs, but they will be expected to provide a significant amount of technical information so that tribal councils can make proper decisions. We can characterize modern Indian students as fulfilling the function of scouts in the old hunting culture. They did not direct tribal activities as much as they provided information upon which the community could act. Indian education from colonial days until very recently was conceived as producing individuals who could and would lead their people into American society's economic mainstream. While many of today's programs are still phrased in those terms, they are not the conditions under which Indian professionals will be helpful to their tribes in the future. We can learn an additional important lesson from this longer perspective on practical education. Any future effort by Congress to manipulate either the use of reservation natural resources or the political status of tribes will almost certainly produce a massive reaction in the field of education. Perhaps the newer studies of Indian education will be triggered by the rapid expansion of gambling activities on reservations or by the drastic budget cuts of recent years. What we must always remember is that education does not stand alone among other Indian and congressional activities. It is always an intimate part of policy considerations, and educated Indians must at all times be aware of events taking place in non-educational fields. The relationship between education and lands and political status is an area of cultural conflict that has not been resolved in this half millennium of contact between Indians and other peoples. All education, formal academic education, and practical education, learning experiences, exists in the gulf between Indians and other peoples and their perspectives on the nature of the world. There would be no use for formal education if worldviews were more similar. But if the white majority has chosen education as the field in which the difference in culture perspective must be worked out, then Indians have to be particularly alert as to the nature of education and what non-Indians seek to accomplish with it. Whatever Indians are asked to do must be done from within the traditional Indian perspective, from a critical examination of the nature of the task, and with the understanding that professional expertise is but a specific body of knowledge existing within the gulf between the two cultures. Indian students must therefore look at their professional education not simply from its set of coherent internal logics that make the professional field unique, but also from two additional perspectives. How does what we receive in our educational experience impact the preservation and sensible use of our lands? And how does it affect the continuing existence of our tribes? These questions must always be asked during the educational years of training. There will not often be good answers because the difficulty in applying abstract information to existing human communities. Nevertheless, Indian students will find much more regarding educational experience if they raise these questions in every educational context in which they find themselves. This is Chapter 12, Practical Professional Indigenous Education. Deloria raises a number of issues that should be considered by Indian students and teachers alike if we are to advance tribal interests through education in general, and specifically professional education. 3 issues I want to expand on as follows. First, what kind of institution can create professionals with indigenous values and beliefs? Second, how can we use the disappearance of a lag time between articulation of policy and the mustering of resources to carry out to advantage of education and self-determination? And third, given what I call the damned if you do and damned if you don't consequence of federal educational initiatives, how do you ensure that the goals or ends of tribal initiatives are practical? This paragraph is called Practical Indigenous Professionals. What kind of professionals do we need in Indian country? The necessary condition is that they receive the requisite technical knowledge, skills, and abilities to advise Indian communities on an array of possible solutions and scenarios to address specific problems/issues. However, this is not a sufficient condition to meet the tribal needs of culturally distinct indigenous peoples. Any tribal council person or politically engaged tribal member can testify to the fact that often when non-Indian professionals are hired to do things for the tribes, the clash in underlying worldviews, that is, indigenous versus Western conflict, makes accomplishment of the tribal goals difficult, if not impossible. The problem of professional expertise in institutions of higher education is that expertise is thought of as culture free or value neutral. It is true that most American Indian students feel they are caught between two cultures throughout their technical and professional education, but I would argue that professional and technical education is in fact not a specific body of knowledge existing within the gulf between two cultures. Rather, professional education and the resulting expertise are implicitly value laden and reflective of the schizophrenic metaphysics of Western society. We can fairly easily describe the attributes we want American Indian professionals to have and identify the questions we hope they keep foremost in their minds. Also, there can be little doubt that students in science, engineering, and business programs often feel caught between two cultures. I have seen students confront these professional programs with considerable disorientation. In fact, there is no greater ex post facto demonstration of the existence of indigenous cultures than the dominant Western culture in America, nor is there a better demonstration of the schizophrenic nature of the world that modern Western institutions, and especially educational institutions, create and advocate. According to one dictionary, schizophrenia is based as a psychotic disorder characterized by loss of contact with environment and by disintegration of personality. An introduction into most American institutions of higher education should predictably result in disorientation to any person who understands their personality as emergent from a specific environment or place. How do we address this profound experiential disorientation? I suggest we create our own indigenous institutions to prepare American Indian professionals. Some will say we have those institutions. We have the tribal colleges. Yes, we do, and they are often working miracles in spite of the limited resources they possess. But the overhead costs, equipment, supplies, facilities, and so on, of operating science and engineering programs are much higher than for liberal arts programs. Also, given the size of reservation populations served by the tribal colleges and the already limited resources for existing programs, it is simply unfeasible for each tribal college to implement and develop programs resulting in their own science/engineering degrees. Typically, this leaves two options to tribes and their colleges. 1. Working with majority institutions, state universities, to create bridge programs. 2+2 or 2+3 programs that address the academic need of Indian students who will matriculate to the majority institution to acquire their degree by completing coursework they cannot get at the tribal colleges. Or 2. Sending their students to college and universities with support programs to assist American Indian students in successful matriculation to a majority institutions. Both options are inadequate, for they fail to confront in a meaningful manner the root of the struggle Indian students face. Deloria may be more than any other scholar living today, has positioned the questions about self-determination and sovereignty in the most radical context possible, the real world, or, if you want a technical description, a phenomenological critical realism. Phenomenological critical realism. Deloria is correct to refer to a disorientation resulting from the conflict between cultures, not worlds. We must avoid the error of talking about life in two different worlds or realities. Sorry, postmodernist and critical deconstructionist, but as I read Deloria, I find this point for almost 4 decades has been to suggest in the broadest sense that questions about our indigenous education and, for the matter of the future of humanity itself, revolve precisely around who we are and how we choose to live in the world. We American Indians have done ourselves a great disservice by speaking of living in two worlds, the Western or dominant American culture and our own tribal indigenous cultures. The needs that both typical options address are almost exclusively academic or intellectual. Do not misunderstand my point. Reasoning skills and intellectual needs are real. Reasoning skills and intellectual needs are real, what I called the necessary condition for indigenous professionalization. But they are insufficient in and of themselves and possibly counterproductive in creating professionals with a complex, integrated, or holistic indigenous understanding of our lives in the world. And above options fail to address the question of how scientific and technical knowledge are understood as part of a large living system of which we human beings are but one small part. The problem with the typical options Indian students must choose from is that, as usual, that they miss the point, the big picture. At the University of Kansas Red Power Conference in the fall of 2000, LaDonna Harris made the point empathically. We do not live in two worlds. If you try to do that, you will be schizophrenic. We are surrounded by a society of metaphysical schizophrenics, people who do not see the phenomenal world of what it is, a complex reality with multiple dimensions. A good number of these metaphysical schizophrenics are scientists and engineers who have, with considerable harm to their person or personality, as human beings, convinced themselves that their feelings or emotions have no place in their objective science. This is the metaphysics of the world writ large. This paragraph is called An Indigenous Institute of Science and Technology in Culture. I would propose American Indian leaders, students, and professionals get together to examine practical consideration of how American Indians and Alaska Natives might create their own MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Give me a second. I want to save this. Okay. We can call it whatever we like, but the goal would be practical indigenous professionalism, technology with an indigenous personality. I expect all kinds of objections. Some will fear an institute of pan-Indian culture and technology. Others will worry about funding and control, and still others may suggest technical issues are distinct from cultural questions. Nevertheless, the reality in Indian country today is most of our tribes are dependent on the advice of non-Indian scientists and engineers who work with conceptual blind spots relative to our indigenous worldviews. We desperately need indigenous scientists and engineers, but not in the mold of those produced by the dominant educational institutions of the United States. Can we create our own indigenous institutions of science and technology in culture? I think a cursory look at the money-making activities among some tribes suggests the answer is yes. But will we? This remains to be seen, but I hope so. It would require a strategic, long-term, multi, or even intertribal effort for an institution the likes of which has never been seen. Given the never-ending rounds of seminars for strategic planning, empowerment, and creative problem solving that foundations and organizations are constantly holding in an Indian country, I have no doubt about our ability to create a plan. The challenge and opportunity, really, is to develop a network of indigenous philanthropy, something that only recently has it made sense to talk about. which can ensure a substantial period of infrastructure building. The cost will be high in dollars, however. The cost of not creating indigenous institutions to our peoples and the place where we live will be exponentially higher. Sobering is the only way I can describe my reaction after attending 2 environmental justice conferences recently. If one contemplates the enormity of the problems facing rural and urban minor communities, including those of indigenous peoples, in the United States and throughout the world, one certainly comes always sobered. But hopefully one is reinvigorated too. With the dedication to finding creative ways to solve environmental problems, we human beings have produced, not intentionally, but by the virtue of a relatively abstract universal worldview, where first, humans are the measure of all things, and second, an Aristotelian compartmentalizing and categorizing of human experience prejudices exploration of human experience itself. Basic research technology transfer, reliable information by bioremediation, ecology-based as opposed to genetics-oriented, technologies, and ultimately community service, all of these can be accomplished by creating an institution that prepares and provides indigenized professional education, practices supportive of cultural diversity emergent out of the diverse geographies and ecologies of the places we call home. We have a long history of being given bad advice, and we are paying the price today. If we are going to make mistakes, and we will, let them be our mistakes. Much of the technology we see being used today has been developed to address environmental cleanup activities. Our actions are essentially reactive in character. On a recent visit to a sister institution, something struck me as we watched the demonstration of the state-of-the-art technology developed to address accidents involving the release of deadly airborne chemicals. Much of what scientists, engineers, and business people work on today is cleanup. My colleague and Potawatomi ecologist George Godfrey has talked often about the creation of a cadre of American Indian environmental scientists and engineers who would achieve success and a status comparable to the highly praised American Indian smoke jumpers in the U.S. Forest Service. And that's where I'm going to stop today, and we'll start up again tomorrow. All right, see you later.